Really glad to be with you again for what is lesson number 3 in our 10-week Psalms for the Soul series. Thank you. Last week we looked at a psalm of lament, Psalm 13, and in this lesson we're going to be looking at Psalm 22, which is also a lament psalm. You can tell that by how it begins. My God, like why? There it is. Why have you forsaken me? Why have you forsaken me? And so David is going to be struggling with this sense that God has forsaken him. And one of the overall questions in David's mind, and that he will answer by the end of this psalm, is it true that God does forsake us sometimes? But you read those words and you go, I think I've heard those words before somewhere else. And sure enough, Jesus quoted these words from the cross. And on the cross, our sin was placed upon Jesus. And at noon, at high noon, the sun was darkened. It was like God turned out the lights as the light of the world confronted darkness. And it was a dark time. It was a hard time. And as our sin was placed upon Jesus, there is this sense that the lights went out and God the Father turned his face from his Son. That is quite possible that that's what is going on here. However, something even more is going on. When Jesus quoted Psalm 22, verse 1, it's like you find a hyperlink in an email, you click on that link, and it brings up a whole nother site. And this was Jesus' way of saying there is something remarkable about Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is going to describe what I am dealing with now. Even though Psalm 22 was written 800 to 1,000 years before Jesus suffered on the cross. And so when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's like clicking on this entire remarkable psalm that ends up describing crucifixion in incredible detail hundreds of years before crucifixion was ever invented by the Phoenicians as a form of execution. So it's a very remarkable psalm. But for David, all he's doing is lamenting. He's putting his pain into word pictures that turn out to be crucifixion descriptions. So let's just follow it from David's perspective, first of all, for a moment. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then in a nice little piece of synonymous parallelism, he unpacks forsaken. Like you're far from me. Why are you so far from saving me? And so far from my cries of anguish. And my God, I cry out by day. Maybe you felt this at times in your life. I cry out by day, but you do not answer. And by night, but I find no rest. And so all of this is unpacking the word forsaken. This is what it feels like when I feel like God's forsaken me. And I'm crying out, Lord, why have you forsaken me? But then he goes on and describes his feelings, his emotions as a result of all of that, having unpacked that word forsaken. He said, but I'm a worm and not a man. I just feel like deeply shamed and worthless right now. In fact, I am being shamed. I'm being scorned by everyone, and I'm being despised by people. So my self-esteem is going in the tank. I feel like a worm and not a man. And then he adds this, all who see me mock me. And he uses two verbs here. First of all, they hurl insults, and they shake their heads. It's like they're just spitting out venom against him, and they're just shaking their heads like, what a loser. It's interesting in Mark chapter 15, as Mark describes what is happening on the cross. He said people are gathering around him and they're mocking him, and he actually uses the same two verbs, hurling and shaking. They hurled insults at Jesus. They shook their heads at him. And then in verse 8, the next verse, he trusts in the Lord, they say, as they're hurling insults at him. He trusts in the Lord. So let the Lord rescue him. It's like sarcastic. Okay, you trust God? Let God take care of him right now. Let him deliver him, since He delights in the Lord. Well, Matthew 27, verse 43, Matthew describes some of the language people are hurling against Jesus, and they are literally saying, let the Lord rescue him, because he says he's the Son of God. And so Matthew just recounts exactly what Psalm 22, verse 8 predicts. And then in verse 14, David continues to write, and again, he's trying to put word pictures to his pain. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. So, of course, when you're crucified, you're hanging by the hour. It stretches your body. The muscle cramping is incredible, and your bones, your joints just start giving way. And also, and it's just like this, like my life's being poured out. And then he says, my heart, interesting enough, from a medical point of view, my heart has been turned to wax, and it's melted within me. And we know medically that a crucified victim is like fluid builds up around the heart. And asphyxiation and heart failure are part of the reason a crucified victim eventually dies. And there's this buildup of fluid around the heart. And in John 19, John adds the detail that to be sure he's dead, the Romans put a spear through Jesus' side. And what comes out? In verses 33 and 34, you will see blood and water, both blood and water. It looks like my heart has turned to wax and melted within me, and I am poured out like water. Then it gets even more specific. Verse 15, my mouth, David says to describe his plight, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. Have you ever felt thirst that way, where it just feels like, your tongue's sticking to the roof of your mouth, there's no saliva left? You lay me then in the dust of death that leads to death. This is serious. This is severe dehydration that takes place in the ordeal of a crucified victim. Severe dehydration. In John 19, John adds the detail that at some point Jesus said, I thirst. It's quite an anomaly, actually, because Jesus would say in his public ministry, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me, for I am the water of life. And yet the water of life and the giver of life, he thirsted in this ordeal on the cross. And then David, Psalm 22 again, as he continues to describe his plight, dogs surround me, as we know people surrounded the cross. A pack of villains encircles me. So you have all this emphasis on surrounding and circling. Sometimes we sing on an old rugged cross on a hill far away in some of our hymns. But they didn't crucify people on remote hills. They crucified them by roadsides so that people could get a close-up look at the crucified victims. It was a means of crowd control by the Romans. Like, you submit, otherwise this could happen to you. And so the cross would have been encircled by people, and they pierce my hands and my feet. People have debated over the translation of the Hebrew word that we translate pierce, and sometimes it's translated in some later manuscripts, it's translated lion. It doesn't really fit the context here. And our oldest and best manuscripts, however, that we have in the original language, out of which we translate the English Bible, is this amazing word pierce. And not only the word pierce, but it's my hands and my feet. What do they do in crucifixion? They put nails in your hands and feet to pin you up on a cross. And all my bones are displayed. He would have been basically hung there naked. It was a very shameful experience to be crucified. And people stare and gloat over me. I mean, there could not be a more precise description of what Jesus was enduring. No wonder Jesus hyperlinks Psalm 22 by quoting verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was saying, this is my story, and my story is no mistake. It was predicted centuries earlier. And by the way, on this idea of his hands and feet piercing, you may remember that after his resurrection, Thomas was not present, one of his 12 disciples, at the first appearance, resurrection appearance. Disciples later told him about, we saw Jesus risen from the dead, and Thomas doesn't believe it. And he struggles with doubts like many of us do. And he specifically says, unless I can see where they put the nails in his hands, where they pierce his hands, and I can put my own finger there, I will not believe. And so all this amazing follow through. And then on top of it all, David added, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. You'd wonder why David would use those word pictures for this feeling of forsakenness from God personally. But it's so precise. Notice they divided my clothes, and then there's a garment that they gambled for, they cast lots for. And John 19 says exactly that. They divided his clothes 4 pieces among them, and then the seamless garment they gambled for. And then John not only describes that, but he actually quotes Psalm 22. But the question still remains, does God forsake us? That's still the larger question. Now, first of all, this is really a remarkable psalm in that it describes the crucifixion. I had a friend when I was pastoring in Southern California he was an attorney. He had been really a hardened skeptic and agnostic, and someone invited him to a Christian event. He went just because of the business networking possibilities, and someone gave the devotionals, and the speaker read Psalm 22, and then the speaker said, this happened 800 or 1,000 years before Jesus was actually crucified. This was written. And it so jolted his world that he eventually came to Christ. And so we could stop right here in Psalm 22 and be just fine. But the question still remains, does God forsake us? Oh my God, why have you forsaken me? That's how the psalm ends. And in these psalms of a lament, we have been saying that it starts with pain, and then it moves to prayer, and then it moves to praise. And this is a psalm of lament, Psalm 22, and so this is what we experience. We've been seeing the pain described in terms of what later a crucified victim would go through. Now here's the prayer. But you, Lord, this is a prayer request, but you, Lord, do not be far from me. Starts with my pain, I feel like you've forsaken me. Why have you forsaken me? But Lord, don't be far from me, for you are my strength. So come quickly, a prayer request again. Come quickly, like, Lord, exclamation mark. Come quickly to help me. I need your help. So there's the prayer. And then all of a sudden you find the praise. You who fear the Lord. David starts doing this. We don't have any record that his life situation changed. But you who fear the Lord, praise him. And all you descendants of Jacob, honor him and revere him. Great verbs here. Praise, honor, revere. All you descendants of Israel. Why? Does God forsake us? No, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. You know, he doesn't, when you're afflicted, he doesn't despise or scorn you or shame you. In fact, the cross says that Jesus identifies with your pain. The prophet Isaiah would later say, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement that meant for our peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. This is amazing stuff. God doesn't ignore us when we're afflicted. The cross is proof of that. He met us at the place of our pain, our sinfulness, and our undeserving. He does not scorn the suffering of the afflicted. He has not hidden his face from him, but he has listened to his cry for help. How do we know that? Well, here it is. He goes on in Psalm 22 to say, and he might as well just say, I'm talking about Jesus now, although he wouldn't have known Jesus, but they were anticipating a Messiah, not that he'd be crucified in their thought, but all of a sudden it's like he's talking directly about Jesus. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, for the families of the nations will bow down before him. For, he goes cosmic on us, for dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Who is that? We know that is Jesus. Just like what Paul said in Philippians 2:9. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every name, every other ruler, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue should acknowledge what? That Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Does God forsake us? No. In fact, he sent his own Son, who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to embed his passion on the cross in Psalm 22 and leave us with the victorious answer that God doesn't forsake us, but that he someday will reign and rule over all the nations. So, as we discuss this and bring this to a close, it would be great to reflect on both the significance and the personalness of what Christ did for us on the cross. Let's not run past that. That's the center of it all. But there are also those times we do feel forsaken by God, so maybe talk about what dealing with those moments are like in our lives, when it seems like maybe God just isn't listening anymore. And how does the supremacy of Jesus, how does it affect our self-esteem? How does it affect the way we look at ourselves? And how does it affect the way that we hear the news and look at our world? May God bless you as we reflect on these amazing truths that are rooted in what Jesus did for us at the cross.